The morning mist clung to the Mississippi River like a Confederate shroud, obscuring the massive fortress city that had become the South's greatest prize and most haunting nightmare. Vicksburg, Mississippi, perched defiantly on its towering bluffs, commanded the great river like an ancient sentinel. On this fateful day in May of 1863, the city would begin its descent into a siege that would echo through the halls of Confederate power. From Richmond to New Orleans, General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood on the deck of his flagship, studying the imposing bluffs through his field glasses. The morning sun cast long shadows across the river, revealing the Confederate artillery positions that had earned Vicksburg its nickname as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. For months, Union forces had attempted to capture this strategic stronghold, only to be repelled by its natural defenses and the determination of its Confederate defenders. Under Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton, the stakes could not have been higher. Control of Vicksburg meant control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy in half and severing vital supply lines that fed Confederate armies from Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. President Abraham Lincoln had declared that Vicksburg is the key to Union victory, and Grant was determined to turn that key, regardless of the cost. Inside the city's fortifications, General Pemberton reviewed his defensive positions with growing concern. His 29,000 Confederate soldiers had transformed Vicksburg into a formidable fortress, complete with interconnected trenches, artillery emplacements, and carefully positioned sharpshooter positions. The natural terrain favored the defenders, with steep ravines and dense woods providing excellent cover. Yet Pemberton knew that his greatest enemy was not Grant's approaching army, but time itself. Supplies were already running low, and the civilian population of nearly 5,000 souls depended on his decisions. The Confederate commander had received conflicting orders from his superiors. General Joseph Eggleston Johnston, commanding Confederate forces in the region, had advised Pemberton to abandon Vicksburg if necessary to preserve his army. However, President Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders had made it clear that Vicksburg must be held at all costs. The city's loss would be a devastating blow to Confederate morale and strategic capability. As Grant's forces began their final approach, the stage was set for one of the most significant sieges in American military history. The Union Army, numbering over 7,000 men, represented the largest force ever assembled by the North. Grant had learned from his previous failures at Vicksburg, abandoning attempts to approach the city from the north through the swampy bayous. Instead, he had boldly marched his army down the western bank of the Mississippi, crossed below the city, and was now approaching from the east, where Vicksburg's defenses were strongest, but the terrain was more manageable. Historical context. Reference from Bruce Catton's Grant Moves South provides detailed accounts of the strategic importance of this campaign. The civilian population of Vicksburg watched with growing anxiety as Grant's blue-coated soldiers appeared on the horizon. Many families had already begun digging caves into the hillsides, preparing for the bombardment they knew would come. The city's newspapers continued to print optimistic reports about Confederate reinforcements and Union defeats elsewhere, but the reality was becoming increasingly clear to anyone who climbed the city's observation points and counted the enemy campfires that dotted the eastern landscape like fallen stars. By the middle of May 1863, Grant's methodical approach to capturing Vicksburg had transformed the once bustling river city into a fortress under siege. The Union commander had learned valuable lessons from his previous attempts to take the Confederate stronghold, abandoning the costly frontal assaults that had characterized his earlier campaigns. Instead, he implemented a strategy of encirclement and strangulation that would test the endurance of both defender and civilian alike. The transformation of the battlefield was remarkable to behold. Union engineers worked tirelessly to construct a network of trenches and artillery positions that gradually crept closer to the Confederate lines. The sound of pickaxes and shovels echoed across the Mississippi hills as both armies dug deeper into the earth, creating a subterranean battlefield that would define the character of the siege. Sharpshooters from both sides turned the no-man's land between the opposing trenches into a deadly killing field where movement during daylight hours meant almost certain death. General Pemberton found himself facing an impossible situation. His Confederate forces were vastly outnumbered, and every passing day saw their supplies dwindle further. The Union naval blockade had effectively cut off all river traffic. While Grant's army controlled the land approaches to the city, Confederate soldiers began reducing their daily rations. sharing what little food remained with the civilian population that had nowhere to flee. The citizens of Vicksburg demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of increasing hardship. Families that had once lived in comfortable homes along the bluffs now spent their days and nights in crude caves carved into the hillsides. These subterranean shelters, dubbed rat holes by their inhabitants, provided protection from the constant Union bombardment but offered little comfort. Children who had never known war learned to distinguish between different types of artillery shells by their sound, while their parents rationed what food remained with mathematical precision. Union artillery commanders established a routine of bombardment that became as regular as the rising and setting of the sun. Admiral David Dixon Porter's fleet of ironclad gunboats joined the artillery chorus, sending massive shells arcing over the city from the river. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical damage, as the constant noise prevented sleep and frayed nerves throughout the besieged population. Grant's strategy extended beyond simple bombardment. Union forces began construction of an elaborate system of approaches and saps, zigzagging trenches that allowed soldiers to advance closer to Confederate positions under cover. The engineering effort was supervised by skilled military engineers who had studied European siege warfare, adapting centuries-old techniques to the unique challenges of the Mississippi terrain. Confederate morale began to show signs of strain as the siege entered its second month. Soldiers who had initially been confident in their ability to repel the Union assault now questioned whether relief would ever arrive. Letters from home spoke of growing hardship throughout the Confederacy as Union forces pressed their advantage. On multiple fronts, the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert Edward Lee was engaged in its own desperate struggle in Virginia, making it unlikely that significant reinforcements could be spared for Vicksburg's relief. General Johnston, commanding Confederate forces in the region, continued to promise that relief was coming, but his dispatches to Pemberton revealed the reality of the situation. Confederate forces were scattered and disorganized, lacking the coordination necessary to mount an effective relief expedition. Johnston's repeated delays in launching an attack gave Grant additional time to strengthen his positions and tighten his grip on the besieged city. The economic impact of the siege extended far beyond Vicksburg's city limits. River traffic on the Mississippi had been the lifeblood of the Confederate war effort, carrying essential supplies from the trans-Mississippi region to Confederate armies in the east. Cotton, the South's primary export crop, sat rotting in warehouses throughout Louisiana and Texas, unable to reach international markets that might have provided desperately needed foreign currency. And supplies as June of 1863 arrived with its oppressive Mississippi heat. The siege of Vicksburg had settled into a grim routine of survival for both besiegers and besieged. The Union Army, now numbering nearly 80,000 men, had constructed what amounted to a small city around the Confederate stronghold. Grant's forces enjoyed regular supplies via the Mississippi River, while the defenders faced increasingly desperate shortages of everything from ammunition to basic foodstuffs. The civilian population of Vicksburg had adapted to their subterranean existence with remarkable ingenuity. Cave dwellings that had begun as crude shelters evolved into elaborate underground complexes, complete with multiple rooms, ventilation systems, and even furniture salvaged from abandoned homes. Families established routines that revolved around the Union bombardment schedule, emerging during brief lulls to tend gardens, gather supplies, or simply breathe fresh air before retreating underground when the shelling resumed. Food became the dominant concern for everyone within the Confederate lines. The city's initial supplies had been calculated to last several months, but the addition of refugees from the surrounding countryside had strained resources beyond their limits. Confederate soldiers received increasingly meager rations, while civilians made do with whatever they could find. Cats and dogs disappeared from the streets, and even rats became valuable sources of protein. The city's few remaining merchants charged exorbitant prices for basic necessities, leading to growing resentment among the population. General Pemberton faced a crisis of command as his officers began to question the wisdom of continuing the defense. Several of his subordinates had approached him privately, suggesting that surrender might be preferable to the slow starvation that seemed inevitable. The Confederate commander found himself caught between his loyalty to the Confederate cause and his responsibility to the soldiers and civilians under his protection. Each day brought new reports of Union advances in other theaters, making it increasingly unlikely that relief would arrive in time to save the city. The psychological warfare between the opposing forces intensified as the siege dragged on. Union soldiers would call out to Confederate pickets during the quiet hours, offering food and promises of fair treatment in exchange for surrender. Confederate sharpshooters responded with deadly accuracy, making movement in the forward trenches extremely hazardous for both sides. The constant tension created an atmosphere of mutual respect and hatred that characterized the entire campaign. Grant's forces had not been idle during the long siege. Union engineers had been preparing a devastating surprise for the Confederate defenders, excavating a massive tunnel beneath the Confederate fortifications. The plan called for packing the tunnel with explosives and creating a breach in the Confederate lines that could be exploited by a coordinated assault. The engineering challenge was immense, requiring careful attention to soil conditions and the constant risk of discovery by Confederate counter-miners. Confederate intelligence had detected signs of Union tunneling operations, and Pemberton ordered his own engineers to begin counter-mining efforts. The underground war became as intense as the surface conflict, with both sides racing to complete their subterranean objectives. Confederate miners worked desperately to locate and destroy the Union tunnels, while Union engineers pushed forward with their explosive preparations. The broader strategic situation continued to deteriorate for the Confederacy. General Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania had begun, drawing Confederate attention and resources away from the Mississippi theater. President Davis found himself facing multiple crises simultaneously, with Union forces pressing attacks in Virginia, Tennessee, and now threatening to split the Confederacy along the Mississippi River. The loss of Vicksburg would have implications far beyond the immediate military situation, potentially convincing European powers that the Confederate cause was hopeless. Military historian James McPherson's battle cry of freedom documents the interconnected nature of these campaigns and their impact on Confederate strategy. The health situation within Vicksburg had become critical. Lack of proper nutrition, combined with the stress of constant bombardment and crowded living conditions in the caves, had led to outbreaks of disease. Confederate medical officers struggled to treat wounded soldiers and sick civilians with dwindling supplies of medicine and surgical instruments. The city's few remaining doctors worked around the clock, performing operations by lamplight in underground hospitals that offered protection from Union shells, but little else in the way of medical amenities. Union forces, meanwhile, struggled with their own challenges. The Mississippi heat and humidity created difficult conditions for soldiers accustomed to northern climates. Disease outbreaks in the Union camps required constant attention from medical personnel, while the monotony of siege warfare tested the patience of soldiers eager for decisive action. Grant's leadership proved crucial in maintaining morale and discipline among his forces. During this extended campaign, the first week of June 1863 brought a new dimension to the siege of Vicksburg as the war moved literally underground. Union engineers had been working for weeks on their ambitious mining project, excavating a tunnel that stretched nearly 200 feet beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, one of the strongest Confederate defensive positions. The engineering challenge was unprecedented in American military history, requiring expertise in geology, explosives, and military tactics. Colonel Andrew Hickenlooper, the Union's chief engineer, supervised the dangerous work with meticulous attention to detail. His miners, many of them experienced coal miners from Pennsylvania and Ohio, worked in shifts around the clock, carefully removing soil and timber to prevent cave-ins that could trap workers or alert Confederate defenders. The tunnel, barely wide enough for a single man to crawl through, extended from the Union lines to a point directly beneath the Confederate fortification. Confederate counter-mining efforts had intensified as evidence of Union tunneling became undeniable. General Pemberton assigned his best engineers to the task of locating and destroying the Union excavations. Confederate miners worked with equal desperation, digging shafts and galleries designed to intercept the Union tunnel before it could be completed. The underground conflict became a race against time, with both sides knowing that success or failure could determine the outcome of the entire siege. The physical conditions underground were almost unbearable. Miners worked in complete darkness except for the faint light provided by small oil lamps, breathing air that was thick with dust and barely adequate for sustaining life. The constant fear of cave-ins, gas pockets, or sudden encounters with enemy miners created a level of psychological stress that rivaled combat above ground. Many miners suffered from what would later be recognized as claustrophobia and panic disorders, conditions that were poorly understood by 19th century military medicine. above ground. The siege continued its relentless progression. Union artillery had refined their bombardment techniques, concentrating fire on specific sectors of the Confederate defenses, while maintaining a steady harassment of the civilian areas. The accuracy of Union gunners had improved dramatically over the weeks of constant practice, allowing them to target individual buildings or defensive positions with devastating effect. Confederate counter-battery fire had become increasingly ineffective as ammunition shortages forced careful rationing of artillery shells. The civilian population of Vicksburg faced new challenges. As the siege entered its second month, the cave dwellings that had provided protection from artillery fire were becoming overcrowded and unsanitary. Families that had initially maintained their pre-war social distinctions found themselves sharing cramped quarters with neighbors they had barely known. The forced intimacy created both bonds of mutual support and tensions that sometimes erupted into arguments over space, food, or other scarce resources. General Pemberton's communications with the outside world had been reduced to a trickle of messages carried by brave couriers who risked death or capture to maintain contact with Confederate authorities. The news they brought was consistently discouraging, with reports of Union advances in other theaters and continued delays in organizing a relief expedition. President Davis's messages continued to emphasize the strategic importance of holding Vicksburg, but offered little in the way of concrete assistance. The medical situation within the city had reached crisis proportions. Confederate hospitals, moved underground for protection from Union bombardment, operated under conditions that made effective treatment nearly impossible. Surgical operations were performed by lamplight in caves that had been hastily converted to medical facilities. The lack of proper sanitation and medical supplies led to infection rates that horrified even experienced military surgeons accustomed to battlefield conditions. Union forces faced their own medical challenges as the siege dragged on. The Mississippi summer brought oppressive heat and humidity that created ideal conditions for disease outbreaks. Grant's medical officers worked constantly to maintain sanitary conditions in the Union camps, but the concentration of nearly 80,000 men in a relatively small area made disease control extremely difficult. Dysentery, typhoid, and other diseases claimed more Union casualties than Confederate bullets during much of the siege. The psychological impact of the extended siege affected both armies in different ways. Union soldiers, confident in their ultimate victory, but frustrated by the slow pace of progress, sometimes took unnecessary risks or violated discipline in their eagerness for action. Confederate defenders, facing increasingly hopeless odds, struggled to maintain their fighting spirit while dealing with hunger, fear, and the constant stress of bombardment. The broader strategic situation continued to evolve as other campaigns demanded attention from both Union and Confederate leadership. General Lee's movement into Pennsylvania had begun, creating an opportunity for a Confederate victory that might offset the loss of Vicksburg. Union forces under General William Tecumseh Sherman were beginning operations that would eventually threaten Atlanta and the heart of the Confederacy. The siege of Vicksburg was becoming one element in a larger strategic picture that would determine the outcome of the entire war. The morning of June 25, 1863, dawned with an eerie quiet that veteran soldiers on both sides recognized as the calm before a storm. For weeks, Union miners had labored in their underground tunnel, and now Colonel Hickenlooper's engineers were ready to deliver a blow that would shake the very foundations of Vicksburg's defenses. Nearly 2,500 pounds of black powder had been carefully packed into the gallery beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, creating what would become one of the largest military explosions in American history to that point. At precisely 3:30 in the afternoon, the earth beneath Vicksburg erupted with a force that could be felt for miles. Along the Mississippi River, the explosion created a crater 40 feet deep and nearly 100 feet across, completely obliterating the Confederate strongpoint and killing or burying dozens of Louisiana soldiers who had been manning the position. Debris rained down across both lines, and the thunderous roar of the detonation temporarily deafened soldiers throughout the battlefield. General Grant had positioned his assault forces in preparation for the explosion, and within minutes of the detonation, waves of Union infantry charged toward the massive crater. The 172nd Ohio Infantry led the assault, followed by regiments from Illinois, Iowa, and other Midwestern states. The soldiers expected to find a clear path into the Confederate lines, but instead encountered a nightmare of loose earth, debris, and disoriented defenders who quickly recovered from their initial shock. The assault quickly bogged down in the crater itself, which proved to be more obstacle than opportunity. The steep, unstable sides of the explosion crater made it nearly impossible for attacking infantry to maintain their footing, while Confederate defenders on the rim of the crater enjoyed clear fields of fire into the depression below. What had been intended as a breakthrough became a death trap, with Union soldiers trapped in the crater under withering Confederate fire. Confederate response to the explosion demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that had characterized their defense. Throughout the siege, General Pemberton immediately ordered reserves to reinforce the threatened sector, while artillery commanders repositioned their guns to pour fire into the crater. Confederate engineers began work on new defensive positions to contain any Union breakthrough, showing remarkable composure despite the devastating effect of the explosion. The failure of the crater assault marked a turning point in Grant's approach to the siege. The Union commander realized that Vicksburg's defenders were too determined and resourceful to be defeated by tactical surprise alone. The siege would have to continue until starvation and exhaustion accomplished what military force could not achieve. This decision condemned both armies to additional weeks of suffering, but Grant believed it was the only way to ensure ultimate victory. The civilian population of Vicksburg experienced the explosion as a terrifying preview of what might come. The blast shattered windows throughout the city and caused several cave dwellings to collapse, burying families who had thought themselves safe underground. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the physical damage, as residents realized that Union forces possessed the capability to literally undermine their defenses in the most literal sense. Confederate morale suffered a severe blow following the crater explosion and the failed Union assault. While soldiers took pride in repelling the attack, the demonstration of Union engineering capabilities made it clear that traditional defensive methods might prove inadequate. The explosion also revealed the extent of Union resources and technical expertise, factors that boded ill for the ultimate outcome of the siege. Supply shortages within Vicksburg reached critical levels as the siege entered its third month. Confederate soldiers received rations that would have been considered inadequate for civilians in peacetime, while the civilian population faced genuine starvation. Horses, mules, and other livestock had long since been consumed, and even leather goods were being boiled to extract whatever nutrition they might provide. The city's few remaining stores closed as their owners had nothing left to sell. General Johnston's promised relief expedition had failed to materialize. Despite repeated assurances from Confederate headquarters, the few thousand troops Johnston had assembled were insufficient to challenge Grant's powerful army, and the Confederate commander seemed reluctant to risk his forces in what appeared to be a hopeless cause. Johnston's inaction became a source of growing frustration for Pemberton and his defenders, who felt abandoned by their own high command. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's memoirs, Narrative of Military Operations, provide insight into the impossible strategic situation facing Confederate forces during this period. The international implications of the siege were becoming increasingly apparent to observers on both sides. European powers had been watching the American conflict with great interest, particularly regarding the possibility of recognizing Confederate independence. A successful Confederate defense of Vicksburg might encourage foreign intervention, while its loss would likely convince European governments that the Union cause was inevitable. The siege had become more than a military campaign. It was a test of Confederate viability as an independent nation. Union forces used the aftermath of the crater explosion to intensify their psychological warfare campaign. Newspapers and printed materials were distributed to Confederate pickets, describing Union victories in other theaters and promising fair treatment for soldiers who surrendered. The steady stream of propaganda had a cumulative effect on Confederate morale, particularly as independent confirmation of Union claims began to filter through the lines. The health crisis within Vicksburg had reached desperate proportions by the end of June. Malnutrition had weakened the immune systems of both soldiers and civilians, making them susceptible to diseases that would normally be minor inconveniences. Confederate medical officers reported increasing cases of scurvy, dysentery, and other conditions related to poor diet and sanitation. The few remaining physicians worked around the clock, but could do little without proper medicines and nutritious food for their patients. July of 1863 opened with Vicksburg's defenders clinging to hope despite increasingly desperate circumstances. The city that had once been known as the Queen City of the Mississippi now resembled a lunar landscape of craters, rubble, and abandoned buildings. Confederate soldiers, many of whom had not received adequate rations for weeks, continued to man their positions with a determination that impressed even their Union opponents. General Pemberton found himself facing the most difficult decision of his military career. His scouts reported that General Johnston's relief expedition, such as it was, had been defeated by Union forces under General Sherman near Jackson, Mississippi. This meant that no Confederate relief was coming, and the garrison would have to survive on its own resources. Those resources were virtually exhausted, with ammunition running dangerously low and food supplies measured in days rather than weeks. The civilian population of Vicksburg had reached the limits of human endurance. Families that had maintained their dignity and social customs throughout the early weeks of the siege now faced choices that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Children who had once played in comfortable homes now competed with rats for scraps of food, while their parents made desperate calculations about survival. The cave dwellings that had provided protection from Union bombardment had become overcrowded refuges, where disease spread rapidly through the weakened population. Confederate soldiers began to show signs of serious malnutrition and combat fatigue that affected their ability to maintain effective resistance. Units that had been at full strength at the beginning of the siege now counted their effective soldiers in dozens rather than hundreds. The constant stress of bombardment, combined with inadequate food and medical care, had created a humanitarian crisis that transcended military considerations. Union forces, sensing that the end was near, increased their psychological pressure on the Confederate defenders. Grant's artillery concentrated on areas known to contain civilian shelters, hoping to break the will of the population and force Pemberton to surrender. Union sharpshooters maintained constant vigilance, making it nearly impossible for Confederate soldiers to move between positions during daylight hours. The siege had become a test of endurance that favored the side with better supplies and reinforcements. The strategic situation beyond Vicksburg continued to influence events within the besieged city. News of the Battle of Gettysburg, where General Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania had been repulsed with heavy casualties, reached both armies through various channels. The defeat of the Army of Northern Virginia eliminated any possibility that Confederate success elsewhere might force Grant to lift the siege. If anything, Union victory at Gettysburg freed additional resources for the Mississippi theater. General Pemberton began receiving informal communications from his subordinate officers suggesting that further resistance was futile and that surrender should be considered to prevent unnecessary suffering. These conversations, conducted in the privacy of underground command posts, revealed the extent to which Confederate morale had deteriorated. Even officers who remained personally loyal to the Confederate cause questioned whether the sacrifice of civilian lives was justified when military victory had become impossible. The medical situation within Vicksburg had become truly horrific. Confederate hospitals, operating in caves and basements without adequate supplies, could offer little more than basic shelter for the wounded and sick. Surgical operations were performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper lighting. The mortality rate among both military and civilian patients had reached levels that would have been considered catastrophic, even by 19th century medical standards. Union intelligence services had managed to establish communication with some Confederate officers who were willing to discuss surrender terms. These preliminary negotiations revealed the extent of suffering within the city and the growing recognition among Confederate leaders that continued resistance would only increase the casualty toll. Grant's reputation for fairness in dealing with surrendered enemies encouraged some Confederate officers to believe that honorable terms might be possible. The question of timing became crucial for both sides as the siege entered what would prove to be its final days. Pemberton knew that every additional day of resistance would cost lives that could not be replaced, while Grant understood that premature negotiations might allow Confederate forces to escape or be reinforced. The Union commander was determined to achieve unconditional surrender that would eliminate Vicksburg as a Confederate stronghold permanently. Confederate attempts to maintain communication with the outside world had become increasingly desperate and ineffective. Couriers who attempted to cross Union lines faced almost certain capture or death, while the few messages that did get through brought only discouraging news about Confederate defeats elsewhere. The sense of isolation contributed to the growing feeling among defenders that they had been abandoned by their own government. the civilian leadership of Vicksburg began to organize informal committees to petition military authorities for surrender. These citizens, many of whom had supported the Confederate cause enthusiastically at the beginning of the war, now prioritized survival over political considerations. Their petitions described conditions in the city that shocked even hardened military officers and provided additional pressure for ending the siege through negotiation, rather than continued fighting. The psychological impact of prolonged siege warfare had created lasting trauma among both soldiers and civilians that would affect survivors for the rest of their lives. The constant noise of bombardment, the fear of sudden death, and the degradation of living conditions had pushed many individuals beyond their psychological breaking points. Confederate medical officers reported increasing cases of what they termed soldier's heart, a condition that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The morning of July 3, 1863, dawned with an oppressive heat that seemed to mirror the desperation hanging over Vicksburg. Like a funeral shroud, General Pemberton had spent the sleepless night in consultation with his remaining officers, weighing options that had narrowed to a single, inevitable choice. The Confederate commander, who had once vowed to defend Vicksburg to the last man, now faced the stark reality that continued resistance would accomplish nothing except the unnecessary sacrifice of soldiers and civilians who had already endured beyond the limits of human endurance. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a white flag appeared on the Confederate ramparts, its stark simplicity marking the end of 47 days of siege that had transformed both armies and altered the course of American history. Confederate Major General John Stevens Bowen, despite his own serious illness, volunteered to carry Pemberton's initial communication to the Union lines. The sight of the white flag created an eerie silence across the battlefield, as soldiers on both sides recognized the historical significance of the moment. General Grant received the Confederate overture with characteristic composure, though he understood that Vicksburg's surrender would represent one of the most significant Union victories of the war. The Union commander had learned from previous negotiations with Confederate forces and was determined to secure terms that would prevent any possibility of the garrison's return to active service. Grant's response to Pemberton's initial proposal was direct and uncompromising. The useless effusion of blood you propose stopping by this course can be ended at any time you may choose by the unconditional surrender of the city and garrison. The negotiations that followed revealed the desperate nature of the Confederate position. Pemberton attempted to secure terms that would allow his soldiers to return home on parole rather than face imprisonment, while Grant insisted on unconditional surrender that would remove the entire Confederate force from the war permanently. The Union commander's position was strengthened by his knowledge of conditions within the city and his confidence that time favored the Union cause exclusively. On July 4, 1863, exactly 87 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Confederate forces formally surrendered Vicksburg to the Union Army. The symbolism of the date was not lost on observers from both sides, who recognized that the birth of American independence was being celebrated with the preservation of the Union that independence had created. The surrender ceremony took place at the same courthouse where Confederate authorities had first declared their secession from the United States nearly 2 years earlier. The terms of surrender, while maintaining Grant's insistence on unconditional capitulation, demonstrated the Union commander's practical wisdom and political acumen. Confederate soldiers were paroled rather than sent to prison camps, acknowledging both the logistical challenges of housing nearly 30,000 prisoners and the political benefits of treating defeated enemies with dignity. The surrendered Confederate soldiers were required to promise not to take up arms against the United States until properly exchanged, effectively removing them from active service for the remainder of the war. The formal surrender ceremony revealed the extent of Confederate suffering during the siege. Soldiers who had once been the pride of their respective states now appeared as gaunt shadows of their former selves, their uniforms in tatters and their equipment worn beyond usefulness. Many Union soldiers were shocked by the condition of their former enemies and shared their own rations with Confederate prisoners who had not received adequate food. For weeks, the civilian population of Vicksburg emerged from their cave dwellings to witness the end of their ordeal with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Families that had endured weeks of bombardment and starvation now faced an uncertain future. Under Union occupation, the city itself bore the scars of the siege in every building and street, with some areas so damaged that they would require complete reconstruction. Historian Shelby Foote's comprehensive The Civil War. A narrative provides detailed documentation of the surrender proceedings and their immediate aftermath. The strategic implications of Vicksburg's fall became apparent almost immediately. The Mississippi River was now under complete Union control from its source to its mouth, effectively cutting the Confederacy in half and severing vital supply lines that had sustained Confederate forces in the Eastern Theater. Confederate forces in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas were now isolated from the rest of the Confederacy, unable to provide significant assistance to Confederate armies fighting in Virginia, Tennessee, and Georgia. The psychological impact of Vicksburg's surrender reverberated throughout the Confederacy with devastating effect. The city that had been proclaimed invincible had fallen, and with it went much of the South's confidence in ultimate victory. Confederate morale, already shaken by the defeat at Gettysburg, suffered another severe blow that would prove difficult to overcome. Recruitment for Confederate forces became increasingly difficult as potential soldiers questioned whether the cause was worth the sacrifice. International reaction to Vicksburg's surrender further damaged Confederate hopes for foreign recognition and intervention. European powers that had been considering recognition of Confederate independence now viewed the Union cause as increasingly inevitable. The demonstration of Union military and logistical superiority at Vicksburg convinced foreign observers that the Confederacy lacked the resources necessary for successful independence. The immediate aftermath of the surrender created complex challenges for Union forces suddenly responsible for governing a hostile population in a devastated city. Grant's administrators had to restore basic services, provide food and medical care for the civilian population, and maintain order among Confederate prisoners and Union soldiers alike. The task of reconstruction would prove almost as difficult as the siege itself. The fall of Vicksburg marked the beginning of the end for the Confederate States of America. While the war would continue for nearly 2 more years, the loss of the Mississippi River and the demonstration of Union superiority in sustained military operations had fundamentally altered the strategic balance. The surrender that had been heard across the South would echo through American history as the moment when Confederate hopes for independence began their final, irreversible decline toward defeat and reunion. The soldiers and civilians who had endured the siege of Vicksburg carried its lessons and trauma with them for the rest of their lives. The 47 days of bombardment, starvation, and desperate resistance had created bonds of shared experience that transcended the political divisions that had caused the war. In the end, the siege of Vicksburg had demonstrated both the terrible cost of civil war and the resilience of the American people in the face of unprecedented challenges.